Yeah, Jeffrey Friedman is an unusual libertarian or classical liberal in the sense that he will defend limited government precisely because of the social complexity issue, not because he knows, for sure that limited government is the morally correct thing to do. He just, given the intractability and widespread observed difference in opinion on all of this stuff, maybe a more humble perspective wherein no one take on politics can dominate all the others is the right way to go. It's this weirdly sort of like epistemically humble pluralist way of getting at, in the end, still kind of a classical liberal.
Yeah, I definitely think that epistemic humility is something that well, it can get you a variety of different results. Again, it's not actually clear exactly what politics epistemic humility should lead to. It is definitely something that attracted me about like the.
Well, I think it would suggest against, say, social democracy, because from the Friedman perspective, social democracy presumes to know too much. So there is a kind of Hayekian knowledge conceit thing going on there. So
yeah,
social democracy requires too much certainty about the interaction effects at the policy level and this and that.
But it's also, Friedman is also a skeptic about any kind of neoliberal technocrat, right? Because Friedman just thinks that technocrats always get it wrong. You can't be a technocrat; things are too complicated, right?
Yeah, I suppose.
So that's why his book is Power Without Knowledge, right? He says we don't have the knowledge that would be sufficient to exercise the neoliberal political power.
Yeah, I guess neoliberalism is a somewhat weaker form of technocracy, in that it would take into account the necessity of like decentralized experimentation,
right?
Which is, it's true that you can just reframe that and reconceptualize that as technocracy from on high introducing market forces. So it's no less technocratic, right? I do understand the point of view, and it's actually it's difficult to shake yourself out of this notion that government intervening to allow a less interventive state, or like a less intervention-oriented kind of dynamic, is itself intervention. It feels almost like some kind of postmodern trickery, but there's no reason to think that that's not actually happening. That is what they're doing. Introducing market mechanisms is a way of state intervention. It's just one form. And it took me a while to shake myself out of thinking that was not the case.
Yeah, I don't know enough about classical liberalism to kind of go in on that. What I wanted to say was that there's a very different sort of conclusion that people sometimes get from epistemic humility, which is basically like conservatism. So the way you get conservatism out of epistemic humility is you just say, look at all of human history. What views have people had through all of human history? Well, if you're being humble, you'll sort of, think that everybody, the majority view kind of got it right. This is what is, I think it's Chesterton calls it the democracy of the dead, right? So the democracy of the dead is an idea that comes out of epistemic humility. You say, if we really think that we should be what epistemologists call conciliationists. So conciliationism means when somebody disagrees with me, if I think if they're basically smart and have the right information and stuff, then I should sort of like move my view towards theirs, right?
There is a successful synthesis, you're saying, possible with conciliatory or conciliationism, is that what you said?
Yeah, so conciliationism, it doesn't just say it's possible. It says that we should do it, right? It says that if I take you seriously and I think X and you think not X, then I should move towards saying I'm not sure anymore, right?
Yeah.
Just on the basis that you're serious and you've said not X. So that's what conciliationism says. And what Chesterton, or whoever it was, the idea of the democracy of the dead, I take it is, or at least put in the kind of modern epistemological language, is if we're going to conciliate on political questions, then why don't we take all the serious people throughout history as interlocutors? And if that's the case, then we should sort of average out all of the views that we've had throughout history about all these matters. Of course, if we did that, we would end up with some pretty anti-progressive views, right? We would say, what have most people throughout history thought about?
The vast majority has not been,
Yeah, what have most people throughout history thought about, homosexuality or polyamory, right? And then if we say we've got to take them seriously, we'd better conciliate on them, then we're going to kind of move back into a less progressive view. I think there's ways for conciliationists to avoid this by saying, just, modern people just have more information than people in the past. Even if they were very smart, we have information that we've allowed gay marriage and like society hasn't fallen apart or anything like that. But you might also think that it's not just a question of it's not necessarily a question that you can get more information about if it's a kind of fundamentally moral or ethical question, right? And if that's the case, you might think that modern people are at no advantage compared to people in the past. So this is one way in which epistemic humility can also get you kind of a more strictly conservative view rather than a libertarian or liberal view. I also think that arguments from humility of a sort are also made by progressives. They say things like, you have to sit down and listen to women and black people and things like that. So to a certain extent, that's a kind of argument from epistemic humility. It's just a kind of selective one, right? Where some people are to exercise epistemic humility and some people are to exercise epistemic certainty. But yeah, I think everybody recognizes that to some degree or another, intellectual humility is a virtue, and we should have, and a lot of people refer to it in one form or another in their political arguments.
Yeah, I in the past few years, the rise of a conservatism that is not informed by Anglo-American sensibilities has reared its head, and it's remarkable how humble they are not. They're not into this kind of absolute power corrupts absolutely, or this best government is that which governs least. Although that's sort of elide big distinction, I think, between maybe more Burkean and more Jeffersonian or something. But yeah, they're not nearly as humble about all of these questions, which lends European conservatism to being more willing to take full-throated political action, and maybe that's because they feel that there's certain fundamental aspects of society that have created a sort of existential crisis, and they're willing to jettison all of that stuff, all that kind of founding father wisdom about government overreach or something. Mm-hmm. But I have been made to realize how parochial to a large degree a lot of the classical liberal for sure, but even somewhat generic liberal Western thinking is, mm-hmm. And but I do think there is a bias toward thinking of people acting in largely material secular terms that does show up in a lot of Western thinking across the board. Mm-hmm. So Jeffrey Friedman talking about public choice theory. You've heard of public choice. Yeah. It's kind of a de-romanticizing libertarian introduction of economics into the political realm. And Jeffrey Friedman claiming that libertarians make the mistake of assuming material self-interest on the part of a lot of their opponents that is really right. Ways a projection of their own thinking. Not everyone is a business major. Not everyone's a business conservative type, yeah. And they're not. They to get back to sociotropic and behaving altruistically. They're getting a model of their opponent's mind completely wrong, and I think I see a lot of that now, even in the suggestion that, for instance, SJWs are operating in a kind of slick material fashion to mm-hmm. get people fired to make room for themselves in the economy.
Yeah,
I don't know how true that is. I'm not.
Yeah, that's an argument that I made this summer.
Yeah.
My piece on the Guild and the Bellows, and now I'm not 100% sure that I really believe it anymore. I definitely think that the background material incentives are interesting, but if you kind of look at, what caused me to rethink this was I kind of observed a cancellation, what you would call a cancellation. I use that term. Nobody has defined this term. I kind of shouldn't use it anymore, but I observed a kind of cancellation in a social group where there just weren't plausibly any material incentives at all, right? There was no job involved. there was no nobody was going to win any kind of award or whatever. Nobody was going to get accepted or rejected from an Ivy League school. It was just sort of like a bunch of friends, and one of them complained about another one in sort of social justice terms, and the other one was booted from the group, was sort of just like ostracized. And so I think that the material incentives view has like some trouble explaining that sort of event, right? That sort of event is a much more social and kind of seems to do much more with like fundamental values rather than about incentives. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine scenarios, and you don't have to just imagine, where at the highest echelons of politics in the corporate world, it's almost definitely some kind of material interest being factored in, because that kind of reward is so much more salient, because they're operating within a limited, a much more circumscribed social group with maybe 5 or 6 power players, and all you have to do is dislodge one to make room for yourself in this some new corporate role or new role in government. So in certain scenarios, yeah, it's almost impossible that cynical self-interest thing is not at play. But the kind of decentralized mob dynamics that we see, that's I guess something more like the religious fervor argument makes more sense there. But even then, why not just call it ideology? I don't really see a lot of strong metaphysical claims with likening it to religion.
No, yeah, I think that there's different. So the idea that social justice is like I agree, it's a kind of weird metaphor that has been arrived at in different ways by people, and I think it's really interesting just because it means like 5 different things at once. And it's one of these things that is like it. There's people who like shouldn't agree with each other, but they do about this despite kind of meaning different things by it, and that interests me. Yeah. So one group that says social justice is like a religion, are like religious people, right? They say things like, well, you want to keep religion out of public life, but then you have this, right? Then you have social justice, and it's just like a religion. So if you want public life to be all about this, then you no longer have any grounds to keep religion out of public life, right? So that's one way of thinking that social justice is like religion. The other one is kind of well, there's a few others. Another one is a kind of I was going to say philosophical, but I don't mean serious philosophical. I mean sort of unserious philosophical, right? So the unserious philosophical view, and there's James Lindsay has an old article about this. I don't mean that he calls it unserious. I mean that he has the unserious view. So that view is kind of like, well, they have some beliefs, social justice people, like aren't responsive to empirical evidence. Same thing, like religious people, they don't believe in empirical evidence either. So they're the same, right? Turns out that that's not going to be like, everybody has to have some non-empirical beliefs that are kind of background beliefs about how to form your empirical beliefs and things like that, right? So you can't really get around to calling social justice a religion in that way. But that's kind of the new atheists. There's a group of new atheists. I don't know if you know about this, but the atheism kind of branched off into social justice and anti-social justice groups maybe a decade ago. Right. I wasn't around for this. I've never been an online atheist. I'm a sort of
You're familiar with Scott Alexander?
Yes.
Yeah, and he's done some good analysis of that kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. There's took place about 10 years ago.
Yeah, although Scott once had a post where he was like, here's my theory about why social justice people don't like calling themselves atheists anymore. And he gave this really long, elaborate theory. And it just seemed really silly to me, because to me it's obvious that the reason social justice people don't like calling themselves atheists anymore is because of Islam, right?
I remember someone leaving that like as a top comment on that very long-winded and otherwise very detailed and in many ways really on point, but it seemed to miss the elephant in the room.
It seemed to miss the most obvious. I
wonder if you were the one who left that. No,
I stopped commenting there. He and I had a bad disagreement 5 years ago. But that's a very different story. But yeah, I think yeah, what happened was people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins started saying things like, "Oh, hey, we've been talking about how silly Christianity is, but like what's even worse, Islam, right? Because not only are they silly, but like they blow things up." Not my view, that's their view, right? I'm not, I'm just saying that that's kind of like their view. And
Yeah.
so then the social justice people heard this and they said, "Wait, we don't like we don't think you should be mean to Islam, so now we're kind of anti-atheism." That was the dynamic there. But yeah, so that but then there was the other group of new atheists who were kind of like, oh, now we associate the social justice group with religion and things like that. So there was that. So that's the second way in which social justice can be like a religion. And the third way is what you see maybe in the work of people like John McWhorter, what you might call the anthropological view.
Right. I think that's the
So
strongest case.
I think it's the best one, yeah. So the anthropological view is something, but it's also kind of like a very thin way of being like a religion, right? The anthropological view is just something like social justice involves some kind of ritual practices of scapegoating and apology and things that look like kind of these mobs that are kind of doing something that's a little bit like a very, very soft form of like a kind of human sacrifice. And you ostracize people. You have these forms of practices that have a kind of historical association with religion, and that maybe just like other things, right? Belief in aliens is going up. Belief in fucking like tarot card readings is going up. Belief
Yeah.
in astrology is going up, right? Um, just like all these weird, as belief in religion goes down, there are these kind of paranormal beliefs that are becoming more popular. Somebody like Clay Routledge is going to say belief in social justice is going up as well because it's filling a void. We need to have something that gives us meaning. We need to engage in these practices because it's a kind of libidinal, human drive to have a group that functions in this way and to bring people in and to kick people out and things like that. And so that's the other way in which social justice might be a religion. We might think that maybe it's two ways. One way is it has kind of the historical structure of a religion. It feels like a religion in that way.
Yeah.
And maybe even descends from kind of Protestant ideas, some people think. And the other way is maybe it fulfills like a psychological drive. We have a psychological drive. We have to have a meaningful life. We have to be able to have a group that it does ostracism and has rituals and things like that. So that's, I guess, four ways that different people think that social justice is like a religion. And it's sort of weird because on their own, I don't think any of them are really convincing. It sort of seems like lots of other things could be like that. But when you kind of put them together, like maybe you think maybe it's kind of like a useful metaphor, but on the other hand, it's like an ambiguous metaphor because if somebody says social justice is like a religion, you don't know exactly which claim they're making, right? So
Yeah.
I've started to kind of stay away from this myself. Also because I've become better and better friends with a lot of Catholics, being here at Notre Dame and just based on the circles I run in online. And so, I started coming at it from the new atheist view of just like the derogatory, oh, this is just like religious people with their crazy, bearded man in the sky. I don't talk like that anymore. And so I no longer find the metaphor sort of
Yeah.
I find it a little bit gauche now, a little bit socially unfortunate.
Yeah. You said a moment ago, if you come at it from all of these different angles, or you a little bit of anthropology, a little bit of metaphysical side of religion definition, a little bit of ideological fervor, a little bit of social dynamics. If you have to criticize it using so many different frames, it just becomes a little unfair, and it starts to look like you're straining to come up with a reason by throwing everything against the wall to see what sticks, and just saying, well, okay, none of them on their own are good reasons to think this thing is hokum. Is that the word?
Yeah.
But if you also think of it from this perspective and that perspective and that perspective, well, yeah, but then you could just do that to anything, right? It's like if you think of I'd prefer to think of new atheists as essentially secular robots who, if you bring in a perspective of media studies, and by media studies I mean Star Trek, the world of Star Trek. I mean they're awfully terrible looking, you know. And so I, you know, it seems a little yeah. So you, it's funny though, because you know, part of me still wants to find a way to criticize them, and
to criticize social justice.
If I'm engaging in good faith with myself, if I'm straining for intellectual integrity, these reasons are no good. But damn it, I still want to come up with a good reason to dislike them. And in a way, the really crude kind of tribal far right has the most plausible and direct answer, because they said they don't like people like me. I'm a white male. That's fucking why. And so there's always something like refreshingly honest about why they dislike it. They don't have to reach for these abstractions that I don't even feel they think in their gut makes much sense. It's just the raw tribal reaction is the one that, I don't know. But you also don't want to feed that into the public discourse as like a proper analysis, right? Like,
no, and also that's something, you know, again, it's something at the kind of social level and the level of like, do I seem cringe and things like that, you know, cringe is like a weird online word, but I'm sure you know it. Yeah. You know, in the eyes of various people, you know, in the circles I run in, you can't make the criticism of just like all these social justice people like just hate white men. That's not, for some reason, it just doesn't grab people. I'm not actually sure. It's not 100% clear to me why, because actually, like, a lot of them do kind of talk as though they hate white men.
Yeah.
And
I'll just say I know versions of these SJWs that are the cartoon version. They're not particularly academic. They're not, you know, you talk to a PhD SJW type and they'll say, they'll rebuke, oh, it's as simple as just hating white men, and here's why.
Right.
But it does. There is a kind of trickle down ideology, and it does essentially manifest like that in among people, maybe art school students, but not, you know, PhD philosophers, right?
Yeah. And this is one of the difficulties in public intellectual life, because you have these theories that you can try to engage with them at an intellectual level, but then there's also the kind of political level of they're inevitably going to be simplified, right? There's going to be a process where, you know, a journalist reads them and they only get half of it. And then some other person reads them and they only get half of what the journalist said. And then they tell it to their friends and the friends only get half of what they said. And you have to think, what happens at the point where you have like 6.25% of the theory? What's left, right? And it's, you know, it's important to think about, but also on the other hand, I'm not sure it's something that you can expect people to anticipate what's going to happen with their theories, right?
Yeah.
But it can also make these things hard to talk about, right? So one issue that it has always been hard to talk about, or one concept that's always been hard to talk about this way, is intersectionality. Because the theory of intersectionality at an academic level is kind of like directly opposed to the implementation of intersectionality at a sort of activist and media level, right? At the activist and media level, intersectionality is usually taken to mean sort of like we add together the ways that people are disprivileged and you see who has the least privilege, right? And that's like the opposite of the way that the theory was originally formulated. It says you can't just add things together because there's sort of things can, you know, there's complicated effects that you need to measure everything kind of independently. So it's almost like a methodological point. So as a methodological point, it's very solid. And the trickle down effect was almost the opposite of it. And or the way, even just the way that we use the word is used, became almost the opposite. So, and it can make, so I think, you know, one way there's a kind of, so you said you like Scott and Alexander. So fallacy of equivocation, also called Mott and Bailey fallacy, right? So one way that people equivocate is they say, you know, they'll use intersectionality in this one way, and you say, hey, I don't think that's true. You know, like, oh, I'm tired of, you know, all this intersectional stuff. It's just really, it's, you know, about like this ranking, because people literally do use it in this way. And then they kind of go back to the Mott where they say, or whichever one, the Mott or the Bailey, where they say, Oh, actually, we just meant this methodological point, right? So the distinction between the way that academic theories are formulated and what ends up trickling down into the public consciousness um, can make it hard to do public intellectual work. It's something I struggle with, and it's a reason that like more and more I kind of try to I try to just put things. I try not to use like terms. That sounds ridiculous, but like I try not to use people's names who some of my readers might not have, some of my readers might have read and misunderstood. I try not to use like catchy terms. I try to just put things in like normal English sentences, and that is something that like analytic philosophy is good training for. We're incentivized to do that when we can, and it pays off in public writing, I think.
Yeah, that's a tough problem. How much is sort of like a pop version of a worldview or ideology, like an accurate distillation of where they're generally coming from, right? So let's say there's a kind of a nuanced right-wing perspective that is anti-immigration, but it doesn't put the locus of blame on the immigrants. It puts the locus of blame on transnational corporations that pit workers against each other. And I have a hard time even describing this as right-wing. It sounds much more left-wing, and I think it was until basically 5 minutes ago. But there's an almost Bannon-esque.
Yeah, this is like the classical left-wing perspective.
Right. Now, if I were to distill that down and say, yeah, they don't like immigrants, how accurate is that? It's somewhat accurate in the sense that immigrants are an unfortunate proxy for who the real troublemaker is, the real, place of blame where that's found. But, it's kind of inaccurate too, because it's somehow the impression left there is that like they think it's okay to just go around and sneer and somehow disenfranchise immigrants or something. That's not right. That's not who they blame, but they do think of them as something like a problem. That's not inaccurate either. And I think something like that is probably correct when it comes to intersectionality vis-a-vis white men, So, yeah. And I suppose if you're like an academic and you're surrounded by kind of reasonable, good faith operators with a kind of progressive ideology, you want to speak to them, not to the frustrating pop version of them that you find held in small doses by many number of people who aren't as intellectual.
Right.
That's kind of frustrating. Well, I actually have to start work in a few minutes, so I think.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. We've covered a lot of ground. It's interesting to hear what you find interesting with this epistemology of ideology stuff.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have. Sorry, that's no problem. I'm gonna have to write more about this. Just based on sort of what we talked about, it gave me some ideas. So it's been really good talking to you. Let me know. Yeah, let me know if there's anything we need to add to it or anything like that.
Okay, that's really cool. You brought up Jeffrey Friedman. I didn't prompt you or anything.
Yeah. I've known him for a few years. Yeah.
Yeah, he's somewhat underread, and it's partly his fault. He's very, very much ivory tower,
Yeah, and he doesn't want to be like he removes his essays from the internet after a few months and stuff like that. And when I told him I'd like to review your book for Quillette, he was like, no, I don't want to be in Quillette.
Yeah.
He doesn't want any, but he has, I think he has a nice life, so why change it?
And he does not. He is alarmed, to say the least, by the explosion of online right activity. And the last thing he wants, and he probably, where I'm going with this. He doesn't want to get caught up in the IDW stuff. I think he would probably,
absolutely not.
He would come closer to the IDW side than the alt-right side. But as we know in popular discussion, get conflated. And he doesn't want.
He's got a unique view. I'm definitely going to write about it academically, and that's sort of, in a way, I aspire to be that as well, right? Like, it's nice to be at an artistic level. It's nice to be unclassifiable, right? It's nice to be sui generis to a certain extent. And he certainly is, yeah.
Libertarian straddle from his essay, What's Wrong with Libertarianism, that pushed me away from a kind of Austrian Murray Rothbard natural rights gung-ho type of thing. And I think it's more congenial to social science, even if it is sort of down on the prospects of social science in many ways. But
yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Cool. I'll let you go. Good talking to you.
Take care. Have a nice day, man.